It's great that we've got so much enthusiasm for what's going on. Thank you for coming. So this morning we have very lucky to have a panel discussion with the artists from the exhibition that opened last night, that I hope lots of people saw. I expect lots of people have lots of questions, and there's some really interesting ideas to be pulled out of it. And I should say that my name's MacKisack. I'm the co-curator of the exhibition with Susan Aldworth, who is going to introduce the artists to you now.
Good morning. I can't believe it's 9 o'clock and we're all here, but well done. And apparently you've just been on Radio 4 for the Today programme, so isn't that wonderful? I'm going to talk very shortly because it's much more interesting for you to hear from our distinguished panel of artists who I will introduce as they talk rather than in a body all at once. As Adam said yesterday, when a lot of the emails came in, we were very surprised by the number of artists, and we thought that having an exhibition would be, because it was an interdisciplinary group we were, it would be an interesting way to explore visual imagery, the lack of it or the excess of it. The thing about visual imagery is that it's profoundly subjective. It's not just visual imagery, it's someone's visual imagery. And I think that subjective quality is something that science at times necessarily has to find hard to explore because they need more objective fact. So I think when science and art comes together in this way, we end up with some very interesting narratives to explore. Matthew, I'd like to just say a couple of words about him. I'm sure you've all been in contact with him over the conference which he has organised brilliantly, but I think you should also know about him as he's an extraordinary academic. I advise you all to read the essay he's written in the catalogue.
By the catalogue.
By the catalogue. And he identifies in history, which he'll tell you more about, that someone like, for example, William Blake had an excessive imagery and talks about that, and someone like Joshua Reynolds thinks that everything that we paint has to come from exactly out of your mind. So the range of experience is huge. So we curated the show, both aphantasic artists and hyperphantasic artists, if indeed one likes those labels. But I think I'm now going to leave it there because I think it's much more interesting to hear from the artists. So first up, I'd like to introduce Isabel Nolan. She found out she was mind blind in 2016. Her work has been extensively exhibited in galleries and institutions internationally and is held in numerous private and public collections. She's represented by the Cullen Gallery in Dublin and the Gallery Kritzinger in Vienna. And she made the fantastic line in the exhibition. Isabel.
Thanks, Susan. So yeah, I don't know whether to stand or sit. I'll do a bit of both. So I didn't sleep very much last night, so I've made very scrawly notes about what to say. I work in a lot of different ways, so the line is just one part of a quite varied practice. So I draw and I paint and I make sculptures and I steel and I make rugs and things. So it's a mixture of stuff I can do by myself in the studio and things that I need gifted fabricators to work with. So at the moment I'm working on commissions for different sort of site-specific locations. So I'm making some rugs and some steel things that will be going on outside the building. But I'm also making paintings, and I have no idea where they're going or what they're going to do or whether they'll be any good at all. So it's a sort of nice mixture of having a certain amount of knowledge about how things might be successful in the world and being completely confused a lot of the time. And I think this is one of the reasons why I work in a lot of different media. Particularly when I'm talking to students, I like to explain that I'm sort of confused by the world in multiple ways. So I think that this needs sort of multiple different media to try and think about these different problems that one faces as a human being. And then one of the other things that fascinates me about working in a lot of different media is that all of these things have very different capacities to make meaning happen in the world. So there's a really profound difference between what will happen when you apply a pencil to a sheet of paper and then when you bend a bar of steel. Both of these things make meaning happen, but in like very, very, very different ways. So just in a very kind of simple, I'm fascinated by the material world, and I'm convinced that like my brain will have different sort of experiences and thoughts if I'm in a city that's made out of granite than if I'm walking around one that's largely comprised of sandstone. So I tend to approach ideas from a sort of very large scale. I quite often open talks by talking about how young the universe is, but it's only, you know, a teenager, it's about 13 or 14 billion years old. And then I go right down to the sort of very intimate, because there's two really simple but very sort of fundamental questions I think that preoccupy me. Every few years I'll have a new way of framing this, but it's always the same concern. I'm completely enthralled by humans and how they bring the world into meaning and make reality happen for ourselves. So we do this with science, and we do it with politics and religion and fiction and with art. And so I'm always thinking about these different these issues by focusing on something very, very kind of particular. Like maybe it's an object, like a statue of, there's a beautiful statue of John Donne in St. Paul's Cathedral I became obsessed with for a few years because he's got these bent knees. Or it might be a particular story about, you know, a history from the history of science or something. And the reason I do this is because, and this might sound terribly naff, but I think it's important to try and love the human world, because I think that's an extraordinarily difficult thing to do at times, because we've made terrible fuck-up mistakes in different ways. So this is the kind of arc of just about everything that I've ever made public. I kind of go, life's often hard and it's without any meaning, as far as I'm concerned, in any kind of grand or a priori sense. Why not look at art? And I say that because I think meaning has to be invented. I think that's the great gift that, or I don't like that word, but that's the thing that we humans do. We invent meaning. We've invented the world that we inhabit. But those inventions that we make, they need to be kind of contested and continually examined. And it can be, as I said, it can be very difficult to love this sort of complex world that we've made for ourselves, but we have this amazing capacity to find beauty and to find narrative in that meaningless, and we love knowing stuff. And I think our love of knowing stuff is sort of worth a great deal. So in terms of what we're all here for, I'm particularly fascinated by the fact that we're these upright, four-limbed creatures, and we're bounded by sensitive skin, and we need light to see, and then the other things that we're aware that will die. And these are the conditions that really determine the kinds of thoughts that we can have, the kind of ideas that we human creatures believe. Because at some point in the distant past we began to make this sort of distinction between ourselves and the world, and we sort of separated ourselves from it. So we feel both of the world, and we feel like we're animals from the world, but we also have this sort of very profound sense that we're somehow separate from it, and we can have a kind of objectivity and opinion about it. And I think this, our physicality, really informs pretty much all of the histories and all of the kind of disciplines and everything that we've created. So I also think it's fascinating, it's coming up in a few ways already yesterday. I think we're very driven by a kind of an aesthetic sense, and that we respond to ideas that are beautiful, and we like elegant explanations. We like symmetry, and we like order, and we like tidiness. And in some way, and I might be entirely wrong, I think we've no right to expect these qualities of the universe, but it's always what we want to find as scientists and as artists. I think we're always looking for order and elegance in a certain way. So yeah, I mean, we crudely, really crudely, we think in terms of up and down, we think in terms of inside and out, and front and back, and same and different, and all of these distinctions, and I think most animals don't. And we attach judgments to these kind of distinctions. So up is more, and up is success, and up is happy. I'm going on too much. I probably shouldn't talk about art. Sorry, I got carried away. I have an audience. Sorry. So, you know, up and highness, it's always culturally consonant with divinity, with virtue and power and hope. And there's this brilliant kind of pithy way that this writer called Tim Ingold described the evolution, and he calls it the eventual triumph of head over heels. And I think this is really important, because we see our minds as somehow set above the world, and our feet are, you know, terrible feet, which are culturally very divided, and our bodies even, these are the kind of pesky, sort of irritating, fallible bits of flesh, and it's that part of us that's constrained by nature, and it's subject to change and disease and decay and all of those things. Anyway, so yeah, I think the mind-body distinction is a terrible fallacy, but anyway, I'm going to stop in a minute. I still have 2 minutes. I still have no idea at all how to think about aphantasia, other than, like, it's a very unremarkable conclusion that we are all different, but largely all very much the same. And in a way, I prefer to focus on the sameness and not, to use a very overused phrase, not kind of fixating fixate on the narcissism of small differences, other than to kind of recognise that life is very rich and varied and you can figure things out by studying difference. But I think the experience of looking at art for me, given that I can't summon its appearance afterwards, and I don't remember what my own work likes, never mind, looks like, never mind what other people's looks like, it's very much shaped. But yeah, this experience, even that it's very much shaped by the sort of immediate experience of the work, of being in the room or the work, I don't think it's in any way, I don't know what the word is, my aphantasia, I don't think in any way sort of, what's the word for denigrate or damages or limits this experience. So I'm going to just finish by reading a quote from a writer called Peter Sheldal, and he's writing about beauty. Oh, I finally found my sentence. My sense is that as a lover of art, my mind's blindness is of very little consequence. I found that a second ago. So this quote, it's about beauty, which I think is most usefully for me, it's thought of as a synonym for generosity. So I'm not talking about, not things that are sort of necessarily nice to look at. I think beautiful work makes spaces that are very rich and challenging and complex, and our brains and our bodies can have a really interesting time. Now, Peter Sheldal. So he writes, in my experience, an onset of beauty combines extremes of stimulation and relaxation. My mind is hyper-alert, my body is at ease, and often I'm aware of my shoulders coming down as unconscious muscular tension lets go. My mood soars. I have a conviction of goodness in all things, and I feel that everything is going to be all right. Later I am pleasantly a little tired all over, as after swimming. Mind and body become indivisible in beauty. Beauty teaches me that my brain is a physical organ, and that intelligence is not limited to thought, but entails feeling and sensation, the whole organism in concert. Centrally involved is a subtle activity of hormonal excitation in or about the heart, the muscular organ, not a metaphor. Beauty is a willing loss of mental control, surrender to organic process that is momentarily under the direction of an exterior object. The object is not thought and felt about exactly. It seems to use my capacities to think and feel itself.
Shall we take all questions at the end, Matthew, or have a couple in the middle? What do you think?
I think we should get everybody a chance
To speak first, and then we'll have to. Okay. Next up, I'd like to introduce Michael Chance. His picture from you is the wonderful painting on the bottom right. Michael, his biography he gave us is an artist living and working in East London. And he can tell you the rest himself.
So, yeah, forgive me for not preparing an amazing, an interesting speech like that, which has also just sort of blown and wiped half of my mind away. Thanks for that. So to return to the simple things, I guess, I'd say, yes, I'm a painter and I live and work in East London, and I suppose a lot of my experience has been of actually moving towards a greater simplicity in some ways, and in other ways towards complexity. What do I mean by that? I think in the past I used to use a lot of different mediums. I was very interdisciplinary, video, sculpture, painting, installation, and I was a musician for a few years, playing in a band, and used to play very improvisatory music. So I have this sort of strange mixture of directions that I've come from in the past that kind of come together in my work, but as I move forward, I suppose, feel like they're coming closer and closer together to weave into one thing, a kind of investigation into painting and just creating space and figures and things on a canvas. And it's both, quite a simple thing and the most unbelievably bloody hard and awful, annoying thing to do. So I suppose my practice is, there's a kind of duality to it where I'm drawing from observation a great deal, and I've done 15 odd years of life drawing quite regularly, of drawing models in studio setting, and with a certain degree of realism, and also drawing out on the streets and everywhere possible I could draw. So that is a kind of sucking up of information, knowledge, and also an investigation in itself of the kind of underlying structure of things. And sometimes that will lead to the painting or drawing being a kind of end product, and other times it's just merely a study. It's an investigation which might lead later on to a composition. So in a way, that's quite a traditional kind of way of working that goes back to Renaissance artists. And I suppose my earliest influences as an artist were Renaissance painters, and I remember when I was about 14 going to see the Sistine Chapel, and obviously it's a complete mind-blowing experience. And so Michelangelo has been a kind of great figure, always hovering behind me, and maybe some of that's visible in that painting, slightly kind of mass, excessive kind of figuration going on. So yes, I suppose in that Renaissance mode there's this combination of investigation of the real through very close looking, and not just replicating the real but pulling it apart. Leonardo's anatomy drawings, pulling away the layers of flesh to try and understand what structures that body underneath, and then using that knowledge to construct imaginative pictures that are complete fantasy in some ways but bear some sort of convincing relationship to a reality that we all can understand. So just to quickly note that I'll be doing the drawing workshops as well. So I probably won't go too much into my own methods maybe now, because I'll save it for the workshop. So that's at 12 o'clock today and tomorrow. So I'll be in that I'll be doing a few little experiments to test out the limits of our imagination and memory, and I'll be sort of demonstrating a couple of approaches that I might take to construct an image from nowhere. Is that all right?
Thank you. Next we have Kirsten Baron, who's red pictures top right from you. Kirsten is a German-born artist and graduate of the University of Creative Arts. Her work ranges from the nearly abstract to the strangely realistic across collage, assemblage, painting and printmaking.
Like Michael, I'm also completely unprepared. I haven't got any notes, I haven't got any plan, because I didn't know what this was until I got here. I'm the odd one out on this panel because I'm hyperphantasic, which I didn't know until I got involved with this. I'm still not entirely sure. I still think somebody will point at me and go, fraud! Because I've been like that all my life, and it's normal. It's my normal. When it comes to artwork, to me art is not a profession or a vocation. It's a condition. It's something I have to do or I get cranky. So I work away in my little studio. I teach part-time to make money, and I don't sell and exhibit much because that puts pressure on you. The other thing for me is that, for me, artwork is beyond words most of the time, so it makes it very difficult to talk about it in an intelligent way. Having talked to the other artists yesterday, particularly these two guys, I feel we've got more in common. I've got more in common with you aphantasic people than I have with non-artistic. I don't know what is the word for normal phantasic. The difference might be that you prepare differently. I think and again, I've only just realised this while listening to Isabel and Michael, that I used to get into trouble in my art school because I didn't sketch enough. You're supposed to prepare everything with loads and loads of sketches, and I found out that the best way of working for me was to make the final piece and then do all the preparation. Because the preparation went on in my head all the time while I did other things, while I walked my dogs, while I read, while I watched television. I don't know, it's constantly working in there. So I usually go straight to the final piece with very, very little preparation. Occasionally I might make a tiny little pencil sketch just to check that the composition works, but then when I actually make it, it turns out different anyway. And of course work develops, the materials affect the image. So while you're working, for me, it changes because of the way the paint reacts, or the glue, or whatever it is I'm working with. I spend a lot of time gluing things together, not in the house. This piece, the Unfinished Business, is probably my most extreme hyperphantasic achievement, because the original shape, which was monochrome, popped into my head fully formed just before going to bed. I hadn't been drawing, I hadn't been painting, I hadn't been looking at art, and it just appeared out of nowhere, and I have no idea why. It was just this shape. Originally it was monochrome, possibly translucent. I don't remember it completely because I have drawn and painted it so often since that's kind of overwritten the original image. But the strong thing was a ring with a piece missing, cracked, broken, breaking up. So I made a quick sketch, and then after that I worked on it for a couple of years, obsessively, again and again. That red one is probably the 12th or 15th or 20th in the series, and I eventually made, again not with a plan, but I eventually made a painting of a complete ring in orange on a grey background that was supposed to be the starting point for something else. It was just an underpainting, and I stood back, looked at it, and it's finished. And since then I haven't gone back to this. And I think that's all I want to say.
Next is Dominic Mason. Dominic's beautiful film is a still from it, bottom left, which has a wonderful voiceover, if you saw it at the exhibition last night. Dominic is an artist curator based in North Lincolnshire. He's exhibitions manager at the 2021 Visual Arts Centre in Scunthorpe and the director of Our Big Picture Grimsby. As an artist, he has featured in numerous exhibitions in the UK and abroad.
I work across I did used to work across a really wide variety of mediums, including film and painting and installation, and for about 15 years, and for years I really struggled to see what was linking those things together. And maybe about 5 years ago I realised that maybe the linking factor was a sense of immediacy, and the artwork's happening in a moment, I suppose, and they're very fluid, and they're very, as I always describe my work, as intuitive. Towards the end of that period, I was working with epoxy resins, like liquid epoxies that were really fluid, almost like water, and you can paint into them with pigments, but then they set incredibly fast. So you can start painting, within 10 minutes you can't paint into that surface anymore, it turns into plastic. So it's like you're working in this very fast way in a certain moment, and then it solidifies that moment. I always felt that maybe I was chasing something that was missing in the work, kind of, it's really hard to explain. It's like I was always chasing something that was slightly out of reach. And I kind of talk about this in a past sense, because 2 years ago I read an article where I found I had aphantasia, and I stopped immediately, and after 15 years of being incredibly prolific in terms of going to the studio every day, making work, and exhibiting quite regularly, I just couldn't do it anymore, and There's quite a few reasons for that. I think firstly, it's a complete changing of all the rules and everything that underpinned my work. I've always seen painting as almost like this spiritual act, this act of magic, kind of creating something immediately in front of me. When I paint a mark, it's like the first time I ever see that. And it's really interesting talking to other painters because that's not necessarily the way they work. And I guess with your work, you see the image before you paint it. And it's almost like that sense of magic was lost. And it was a mix of feeling like something had been completed, but also, a sense of loss somehow, a loss of creativity. And but also, I suppose that again, it's had such a profound effect on me. And it's really interesting as an artist. Francis Bacon, he stopped painting for 2 years first when he saw a Picasso exhibition because it completely blew his mind. And I guess it's similar to me that it's. For a while I couldn't go on, and the piece I actually made for the exhibition here in Exeter is the first thing I've done for 2 years, which was specifically for this exhibition. And so that was kind of a real challenge. Andrew actually told me about the exhibition happening, so I got in touch with Matthew, and I felt like actually I really wanted to make. The other reason I stopped is it seems such an incredible idea to be kind of in terms of the arts, within art, as in a lot of fields, pretty much everything's been done and everything's been explored. Whereas this is incredibly new research that completely changes the way you kind of think about how artists make work and how people look at artworks. And it was really difficult for me to make any work without really tackling that. And because in the past everything's been intuitive and in the moment, and now I'm thinking actually I need to make work that's about something. So that's a real challenge for me. And the piece I made for Exeter, I mean this isn't a still from the video. This is a photograph I took because I hadn't got a clue what I was going to do. I knew I wanted to make something about mark making and loosely about painting, and it's which is okay for me because I was used to being in exhibitions where people would ask me, what are you going to do for this exhibition? I don't know, you've just got to kind of trust me, it'll be fine. Luckily Matthew trusted me with this one and it's worked out okay. So basically I had a real break from my practice, and the work I've made is a video. I've never made a video before. It's autobiographical. I've never made autobiographical work before, and I kind of see it as a starting point really. And if you get the chance to see the video, there is a monologue that you couldn't hear last night, and which is about me talking about that experience and the experience of where do you go as an artist when everything has kind of changed. The other thing I just wanted to say is it only affects me as an artist, and I can imagine if I wasn't an artist and the curator, then I can't think it would really have much of an effect on my life. But it's only because that's what I've kind of dedicated the best part of my life to. It's been an interesting time, and I think that's all I've got to say.
And finally, I'd like to introduce Andrew Bracey, and his picture is top centre, still from his film. Andrew Bracey is an artist living in Waddington who's exhibited nationally and internationally. He's programme leader for the MA Fine Art at the University of Lincoln.
Okay, so I'm just going to pick up a couple of things that I said. One was what you said, Kirsten, which is, so when I was a student, I made lots and lots of things in sketchbooks because that's what I was told that you had to do. And but they had nothing to do with the work that I was making outside of sketchbooks because I was just doing it as a thing. And as soon as I stopped being a student, then I stopped making sketchbooks. I write all the time, and I kind of think that makes sense with the aphantasia, that I remember things that are words that I form rather than images. So that's how I'm making sense of the world in a way. So then when I found out that I was to have no mind's eye, I was going through the crisis in my work anyway, so I'd stopped making artwork, and I then kind of had that moment of, that I'm sure many people in the room have, that you go, oh, there's this thing, and then found a BBC article that kind of started to explain it for other people. So I've always been interested, I think, in looking. As artists, our training is often about noticing things that are often unnoticed. So while the artists have been talking, I've been really fascinated. There's a bit of dirt down there that the cleaners have missed. So I've been kind of fixated on that and what that could be. And so I'm also the sort of person that often, when I'm going through a place, that I'm noticing that really interesting thing on the building that's up there rather than what's in front of me. And I kind of explain this. I used to be a projectionist in a cinema, and in the pre-digital age, we had Q dots in the top right-hand corner, which, if you've seen Fight Club, it's been explained really clearly on there. So you used to pay real attention to this little bit that's in the top right that had nothing to do with the film. It had come at this point that was, and if you did your job properly, nobody had noticed that you were doing your job properly. It kind of carried on. Whereas if you didn't do your job properly and you missed that Q dot, which is there for like a sixth of a second, then your work would be noticed because the film would disrupt and there'd be numbers appearing and so on. But what it did is it made you notice things that were really insignificant to the film. A, the dot, but also what was happening in the top right-hand corner, which most people don't notice. So I kind of see that as a little bit like the world that I kind of noticed. In my practice, I think a bit like what's come up. I kind of, for a long period of time, I chopped and changed with different subjects and different contents until about 10 years ago I decided that I really wanted to focus on what I love most. I do with my students quite a lot. I say, right, if there's one thing, if there's one pillar, if you took that pillar away, then the whole of your art practice would fall apart. What would that one thing be? And for me, it was painting. Even though I worked in lots of different media, like people have said, and lots of different subjects. So I pulled back my work to being about painting, which allowed me to work in different media. And when I go and look at paintings, I quite often get right up close to them. I'm not quite so interested in the overall compositions. I kind of realise that actually I normally get to the distance. It's about that, where a painter would be applying a brush, and so I get up to that view to kind of see it and move around it in that way. Which often means that I'm noticing maybe things that aren't the full event. So maybe something that's in the background, or a particular mark, or a particular colour, rather than what the narrative or the content is. So I started making work about that, where I replaced figures, because figures in most paintings are the main event. They are the thing that most of the art historical information is about. Most of the time when I've been with people looking at paintings, we want to know what the person is. So I've for a long period of time, I've been replacing that with something else, which might make you imagine what's underneath. It might make you look at other things in the painting because you want to ignore what I've done to it, or it might be there's a relationship to something that is abstract in the foreground. And then I had the thing of finding out that maybe this reason why I was really interested in looking at things that were there and noticing other things that are there is paying attention to those things, to store them as memories of things, because maybe some people can just store those as an image that they can kind of click back into. So I started thinking about, well, maybe I could make work that describes a shift from something that is clear and focused to something that is moving away from there being any kind of tangibility that's there, that's a bit like when you shut your eyes and actually all I can see is the colour of the light that's bright coming through to me, that's there, whereas some people will be able to conjure up the image of the painting that's right in front of them. So the body of work that's in the show starts with an amazing painting called The Raft of Medusa by Jericho, which I've never seen in the flesh. I've only seen from reproductions and reading about it. But the painting was tells or was a recount of of a ship that sunk, and some survivors built a raft from the bits of the ship and stayed on there, and some of them died and they ate the people that had died and things. But it was constructed from Jericho, from survivor accounts, from newspaper articles that were of the time. So there was no direct image of this scene in front of him as a painter when he painted it. He built a reconstruction of the raft. He had people pose in positions of it so he could see what was in front of him. He had corpses that he painted, but the images itself was just constructed quite meticulously from what he'd been able to gather. So I thought this might be an interesting painting to use as a thing of being constructed from imagination and by accounts from the artist. And I sort of start with a reproduction of that, and then I smudge it out. So sometimes I've had a photograph, an actual photograph that's the size of the original painting, so a reproduction of it, and I use a kind of a chemical that smudges the ink together and makes it into this mass of one colour. And this one is done digitally, so it's smudging the image across, and if you see the film, then it starts to disintegrate from a fixed thing to become something that's more like a massive light that's shining through my eyelids, because that's what I remember from it. And so it's just what the memory is then that you have of the starting point. For some people that'll be an image that they can recall, and some people it will be something, I guess, that's more about, oh, I remember that is in the middle and that is up there. I did make some notes which I was doing there, but I think that's probably about it for me.
We should get some questions in. Who has a question? Yes.
It's really addressed between Kirsten and Dominic, or really an observation, because for Kirsten, when I created art in the past, it used to be the way you did it. I could, images would come up, like you said about your piece, you could see it and you could create it. And I did that, and then I became aphantasic and felt like you do, Dominic, that how am I going to create art? And it's been a real struggle, because I've had to learn or find new ways. And I thought I'd lost everything, and it's taken a long time. But gradually, I'm learning to do different ways, and it's a completely different form of artwork. So I've sort of gone from one to the other experience. So I'm relating to both of you, really.
I think it must be an even more profound experience to kind of shift between the two, maybe, because for me it was just a sense of discovering something about that I'd kind of actually always known about myself in a way. But yeah, I think it. Yeah,
I imagine. I mean, for me, it would be devastating if I lost my inner vision.
Yes.
Even though not all my artwork is like this. This was the most extreme example. I do spend a lot of time in the same way as these other guys, just making marks and then seeing what happens, and keep going till it's finished.
Have you always been aware that you're different?
I've always been the odd one out.
Apart from just being an artist.
But I've always been the odd one out, but I was not aware that I had a particularly lively inner vision.
Yeah. Because that was my normal for me.
Yeah, exactly.
That's my normal.
Yeah.
That was just normal.
Every time I'm a jeweller, and every time
Could you speak a bit louder, please?
I'm a jeweller, but I've not been making for about 6 months, and I've only known of aphantasics for about 3. But every time that I made something, I would hold it in my hands in awe that I had created it, because I hadn't seen it in my imagination. But my question is, are any of you exploring trying to grow Fantasia? Because I have some limited experience of vision myself, like when I'm very tired, as I'm going to sleep, in deep meditation, like breathwork, things like that. I see some things, but aside from that, it's complete. I don't even have dream images. And I wonder if you are exploring growing Fantasia.
Yeah, no. It's not anything that I've not. Don't necessarily feel I'm lacking something.
Okay.
You know, as I said, it came, like finding out about it came as a shock to me. The shock wasn't that I couldn't visualise things in my head. The shock was that everyone else could.
Yeah.
For me, I think it would take away something as well if I did do that. I mean, if I'm improvising an image on a canvas, I think of it very much as a sort of dreaming through drawing. And I don't have any images, not even in dreams either. So it's a way, you know, that moment of drawing and painting just in an improvised way, similarly to dreaming, I think, in my very bad understanding of the brain, is less frontal cortex and more at the back. And because it's an unconscious, intuitive thing that you're doing, and so you're not consciously willing images, you're sort of letting them happen. And although that's not visually in my brain, it's happening on the canvas in front of me. So, I don't know, I feel quite positive about aphantasia because it gives me even more of a reason to do this thing and to actually manifest it in front of me because I can't see it any other way. And so yeah, I think the relationship to dreams is really interesting, and like dreams, it sort of throws up images that are very revealing and strange, as you might have seen in my picture. If anyone wants to give me a Freudian analysis, very welcome.
I find it interesting, and I'm listening yesterday and today, this keeps coming up, that people are worried about having this condition, aphantasia. Some, not everybody, but, and I'm also curious that sorry, what's your name?
Dominic.
That it had such a devastating effect on you. I myself am an artist, and I only discovered that I was aphantasic a few years ago. I never heard of it. I thought people would just, I thought it was a metaphor. I didn't realize there were such things. I still don't believe it, by the way. But what I find is the condition is extremely exhilarating for me as an artist, because every image is fresh. Every time I open my eyes, I've never seen it before. It's a fresh, exhilarating experience. I think it would be such a burden to carry images in your mind the whole time.
Yeah,
imagine what a horrible, I think it would make me nauseated. But so I'm just curious, Dominic, why wasn't it just a thrilling, exciting moment for you instead of just
it was thrilling and exciting, and I wasn't worried, and I wasn't. It didn't distress me not to make art. You know, I guess I've learned over the years that sometimes you just have to go with, you know, what feels right, and at the moment, at that time, what felt right was not to make. It didn't distress me. It was exhilarating, and I understood actually what was driving my art in the previous 15 years, which was an exciting thing. But then you know, I questioned, you know, do I need to make art anymore? It's almost like it was a kind of resolution, and a kind of a missing part of this this thing that I've always described as being out of reach that I was chasing. So yeah, it doesn't worry me, and it's only art. It's not kind of.
But isn't it what said earlier by one of you that art is a condition? It's more like a life condition.
But I guess I believe that as well. I've always been. Art has troubled me. It's something I feel compelled to do, and it's not necessarily the easiest thing to do.
Compulsion is another good word, yeah. I find it interesting that you said you imagine that having these pictures in your head would be a burden. And I can relate to that, but for me it's words. Do you have an interior monologue?
No.
Yes. That's interesting, because I have a constant stream of words in there as well. It's sort of the images mainly, they're not constant, but they're there, but they're just there and they're quiet. And they're beautiful, and it's everything I've ever seen is in there. But there are constant words, talking, and that's what I want to get rid of. I've used meditation and music to quieten that down, and I would happily lose the mic is chatting away.
In the past, sorry.
I'm an artist also, and I'm on the hypophrenesic and I think on the extreme side of it. And I'm just now understanding that when people say that, like I do very, very realistic art, and I've always had extreme value judgments of other art and had no interest whatsoever in abstract art or non-representational art. And I would be like kind of judgy about it when people say that they're just experimenting and like seeing what happens, and I'm like, but all you have to do is think about it. Why make a mark if you don't know what it's going to, if it's not like towards making something specific? Because in my mind, I'm like playing the whole process ahead of time. So I'm actually like the process of not knowing what it's going to look like before you make the mark sounds really exciting to me, and I can't even begin to imagine what that's like.
It's interesting because again, when I found out about it, the first thing I thought is actually, if you could see pictures in your head, doing art must be really easy. From talking to artists, I've realised that's not necessarily as easy as it sounds. First impression, it's just like, wow.
It's actually very, very difficult because it's wrong. It's finished. Like, to make something realistic, it's wrong for the vast majority of the process.
To make something abstract, it's also because the image in my head isn't made of oil and canvas. Mm-hmm. It's made of light, and to translate light into paint is actually not easy.
And the yellow jumper there.
Yeah. Thank you, Edward. And this is a question for all of you. I think I'm hyperphagic as well. And Kirsten, I think like you, and I used to get into trouble for not doing the background work beforehand, and it drove me absolutely mad with my tutor because he didn't get it. But you mentioned as well it being a game changer, all this. How do you think that will affect arts education going forward? Will it affect the validation system? It's a big question, but I'm really interested in that side of it.
So I teach, and I've shared this, and it's quite interesting. I gave a talk a couple of weeks ago in another institution. There was about 100 people in the audience, and 2 people kind of kept their hands up in the air when I said, right, who can't see that in front of them? And I think that it's just, I don't think it is a game changer. I think it's just a thing of recognising something that we all know, that we are actually all different. We all think in different ways. And so I think if there's a game changer of anything, it's just about making sure that that's part of the articulation that you do, whether that's so just explaining, just preparing the audience, if it's in art education, that this is the approach, this is the way that you think of it.
What if you've explained it and your tutor doesn't get it? Nice.
Then you've got to explain it better.
Find a different tutor.
I think just one more question next to you there.
I'd be surprised that I've never done art, but why is there all this sketching to do? If we're the 2% of the population and the expectation is that people can have visual imagery, because that is the norm of 98% of the population, why does the art teaching do all this extra sketching that people don't need?
That's a good question. I am supposedly at the other end. I may possibly do more work in my head than other artists. I don't know.
I find that fascinating because I've never sketched, and I was exactly the same.
Oh, right.
So I'd never. I'd prepare all my sketchbooks after I've done the.
Yeah.
I don't think it really has a bearing. I've never done prepared.
Yeah, so maybe it's just something in our education that's completely pointless and just there to give people marks. I don't know. I mean, you're a teacher, so
sketching, I think it can be a way of getting down ideas, because your memory changes all of the time. So what you think about something now will be different than what you thought about it 3 weeks ago. So that's a reason for being able to track and chart your progression. I think that it's also just a form of training. You can get out of practice of doing something, so it's a way of keeping up with that. Then it's just that sketching doesn't have to be in a sketchbook, and to be in that form, I think that probably most artists have their form of what sketch would be. They just find the right way for them. I think that it's very unusual for people just to produce masterpieces like that, one after the other.
Oh, I don't make masterpieces.
As the lady said over there as well, there's a huge degree of difference between being able to see something and being able to draw it.
Yeah.
So that is the point of sketching, and you know, in terms of representational painting, it's absolutely fundamental. And quite obviously there's a series of artists who are largely abstract or conceptual, so may not be as relevant to you. But in terms of the sort of long tradition of like figurative image making, I would say sketching is absolutely the core and fundamental part of my practice. And it's not just sort of gathering ideas, it's an investigative process as well. So really trying to pick things apart and understand better, you know, space and form and things like that.
And it's completely
just looking at something. You can look at something for 3 hours, and you can look at something for 3 hours while drawing, and you'll notice different things. And drawing leads you into a different series of investigative kinds of ways of looking. So
drawing is definitely worth looking at. He's right, and I'm not opposed to sketchbooks. I teach at a fairly low level. I teach and approve kids who've been excluded from mainstream schools, so they're low achievers, and I do make them keep sketchbooks, partly because it's a requirement for GCSEs, but also because of this practicing and learning to develop their ideas, because I'm not at all opposed to making sketchbooks. It doesn't work for me. I do most of my preparation in here. It was the same when I was writing, which I don't do anymore. I didn't start actually writing until the story was nearly complete. It then evolved as I wrote, but most of my preparation takes place in my head. And I like it that way because there's a natural sieving process where everything that's not important or not interesting falls away. I forget it because I'm not interested, and then I'm just left with the masterpiece.
But I think when you're talking about the educational system, the falseness in that is not whether you sketch or not. It's the linearity of the process from idea to, you know, experiment 1, 2, 3, 4 to final piece. And even for me, who does a lot of drawing, it never works like that. You know, the drawing is just this sort of nebulous cloud of stuff that's surrounding, and occasionally a painting flies out. It's never like, oh, I have an idea, let me work it out, and eventually I'll get there to this final piece. So, but, yeah, it's a big sort of subject. I think there's good reasons for it existing like that in education to make it measurable.
Yeah.
But that's another conversation.
We've got one more time for one brief question. Yep.
So I'm at MacKisack and I'm a fabricator. I find that I can often have an intuitive sense of like the heft and feel and mechanical properties of a thing, but I have to actually make it to have a good understanding of what it looks like and how people are going to feel about the object. Do all of you find yourselves doing iterative work, or is it? I mean, I'm not quite sure what the equivalent of it in like painting is to iterative work and fabrication, but like it sounds like many of you have a process by which you start, and then as you produce, it informs the rest of the production. Do you get to a point where you go, I really like where that was going, now I've gone somewhere I don't like, let me pull that back? Like, is that your form of iterative process?
That would happen for me a lot, and quite often I make very sort of like crude versions of the thing and I don't, this is where I'm super puzzled listening to everybody, because I have no idea how I think of things, but I think you put it quite nicely, you have some intuitive sense of the heft and the size and the dimensions that a thing is supposed to be, and then I sort of make miniature versions out of like bad cardboard or something, and work with people who can do 3D visualizing on computers to try it out. But there's always, there's so much ends up in the bin because it's somehow wrong, but I don't know what it is. I'm not trying to match it up to something. That sounds profoundly difficult, to try and like match up to some ideal version of the thing that's supposed to be. And there is a certain, I think, of really, it's sort of lovely hearing everyone talking, because there is a certain beauty to that thing, I think, of being in the position of not knowing how things are going to turn out and only finding it out. And it's very exciting when something does work, but equally it's very frustrating then, because you don't even know what you're trying to do half of the time. It's just like a very sort of inarticulate moulding space and trying to make space happen by sticking things together and bending them. It's very peculiar. But I'm really jealous of the people with the mind's eye. It's my, I have to say. I'm a jealous aphantasia.
On that note, we'll have to finish there to keep things going. And these guys, I think, are sticking around for the rest of the weekend, so you can collar them and
Follow the dream.
yes. So please thank our artists.